You're listening to Parents You've Got This, the expert guide to parenthood. The complete guide to fertility, pregnancy, birth, baby and parenthood. This podcast is proudly supported by Mistela, a natural origin skincare for babies and children, recommended by healthcare professionals. Mistela by Parents Side since 1950.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Expert Guide to Parenthood podcast. We're your hosts, Christy Hopwood and Freya Owen, and we're the co-founders of the parenting education business, Parents You've Got This. Our parenting business is all about helping you prepare for birth, baby and parenthood. And today we're going to be talking about a labour topic. We're going to be talking about trialling for a vaginal birth after having a caesarean. So this is either called a TOLAC or perhaps a VBAC, vaginal birth after caesarean, and we are welcoming back to the podcast chair our obstetrician expert, Dr. Peter Jurcevic, who is going to present all the latest research and evidence around this topic. So Pete, thank you so much for being with us. You of course work in both public and private practice with more than 30 years of experience, and we are very lucky to have you here sharing your wisdom today.
Nice to be here.
Now, what is it, Pete? So we've said we're talking about a VBAC or a TOLAC. Can you give us a little bit more information about the topic today?
Sure. So for a woman who has had a caesarean section, and we'll presume one, for whatever indication it was in her first delivery, or perhaps even in a second or third delivery, but nonetheless would like to try for a vaginal birth attempt after that previous caesarean section, we refer to that as a TOLAC or a VBAC.
How common is it for a woman to try for a vaginal birth after having a previous caesarean birth?
There isn't actually a universal stat because it's very jurisdictionally based, different hospitals, different motivators, the ability of the hospital where you would be presumably birthing to have that particular type of delivery, their capacity to be able to provide safe care. But it represents a percentage of the population, and nonetheless every woman should be afforded the opportunity to consider it if they wish to.
So Pete, let's talk about that. Why might someone want to try for a VBAC after a caesarean?
Sure. Multitude of factors. For a woman, for example, who might have had her first pregnancy and been very motivated to attempt a vaginal delivery, but through circumstance was unable to have that delivery as she wished and had a caesarean. There are some indicators where you must have a caesarean section, and placenta previa comes to mind. Then there are other situations where it was a breech presentation late in the pregnancy and you deemed it wasn't safe to try for a vaginal delivery and chose a caesarean section. There might have been a situation where you actually laboured, and then during the course of the labour the baby became distressed or unwell and needed to be delivered urgently by a caesarean, or even became stuck or obstructed through the birth passage, and so a caesarean section was required. So you didn't meet your target outcome that you'd hoped for. And you get pregnant again, the pregnancy is uncomplicated, you're motivated, and you're thinking, I would like to try to see if I can have a vaginal birth. I'd like to try to labour and see if I can have a good birth at the end of that labour. And we call that a TOLAC.
And so say that you're a mum who's pregnant and you're thinking about having a TOLAC. What are the potential risks or complications that could occur if you choose that mode of delivery?
Sure. You can break it into two parts, and part of it is with reference to how we go about trying to help to triage you and guide you in terms of the birth safety component. Because every delivery, both a caesarean section and an attempt at a vaginal birth, will carry an inherent degree of risk. And we try to mitigate that risk to ensure that you and the baby stay safe. With reference to a TOLAC, a trial of labour after caesarean section, there are the normal issues associated with labour that you have to negotiate. So will you have a normal delivery by definition where you push your baby out yourself? Or will you need to have some assistance with the forceps or a vacuum? Well, not so much a complication, but it's not normal. Would you end up needing to have an emergency caesarean section, either because the baby becomes distressed or obstructed, you're not progressing well, or perchance if you were to have one of the feared complications, which is where the scar in the uterus from the previous caesarean section breaks open, or dehisces as we call it, under the stress load of the contractions. And if that happens, that can be quite risky to you and the baby in terms of implications for blood supply and oxygenation to the baby, and then of course internal bleeding and risk to you in terms of internal hemorrhage and even risk of hysterectomy at delivery. You'll be pleased to know with reference to that specific issue that we quote about a 1 in 200 chance of that happening. So if 200 women are in a room, they've all had a caesarean section, they all labour, one of them, her uterus could rupture. And we know that about a percentage point of those women, if that happened, could have some dire consequences. Not surprisingly, we have safeguards in place to try to protect against that and to react to it when it happens, but it is a risk. And then, of course, the other issues associated with a birth in terms of would you end up with any tearing, and that would be potentially complicated or troublesome to recover from, potential bleeding at the delivery, which is inherent after a normal birth when you haven't had a caesarean section, and then challenges to your pelvic floor and so on that you might experience after a birth that you may not have had having had a caesarean section and bypassing the birth canal the first time.
Want some extra tips to help you navigate parenthood? Join a Parents You've Got This masterclass. Visit www.parentsyouvegotthis.com.au and sign up for a masterclass today.
So Pete, all of that said, what would make someone a good candidate for a TOLAC?
Sure. It's probably a way of answering in two parts. It's motivation is key. So having a woman who is motivated and desirous of that, and then, of course, appropriately counselled about her understanding of the risks that we went through in that previous question. And then preferably not having any demonstrable risk factors where we would say that you would be a less safe candidate to try. So there would be things that we would suggest would preclude you. So once again, if you have a placenta previa blocking the cervix, that's just not going to be good. If you are having a complicated pregnancy where you may need to be induced, we know that inducing in a situation where you've had a previous caesarean section has a higher, if I use the expression, fail rate for having a normal delivery at the end of that birth process. So your chances of a normal easy birth would be less if we have to induce at the beginning. It would be interesting if you had a certain size baby the first time and perhaps disappointingly that baby got stuck coming out, and then we could demonstrably say to you that your next baby is bigger. So it would sort of beg the question, if the first baby was small and had trouble coming out, how are you going to get a big one out? And then, of course, there might be some other situations where if you had a twin pregnancy or a breech pregnancy, we might sort of talk to you about whether or not that is just a bridge too far in terms of the acceptance of the inherent risks of those births alone. Now you've added to that with a scar in the uterus. So candidacy usually just comes down to motivation and having a good pregnancy, hopefully no really compounding issues from the previous birth where you'd really question the safety of trying again when it went so poorly the first time. And then you put it together as a package and you say, yeah, I think you're a good candidate, or I'm not sure if you're a great candidate, and allow the woman to then use that information to make an informed choice, and then we'll support that decision. And, you know, there may be situations where we may agree to disagree about whether or not you should, but if we can still provide you with care and keep you safe and react to any problems that occur during the birth and get a safe outcome for you and the baby, well, that's the key.
And are there any hospital regulations around wanting to try for a natural birth after having a caesarean?
Probably wouldn't be so much regulations, but there would be hospital policies. And the policies are designed to ensure that we have consistency in the way we provide care. So whether it be me, my colleagues, the junior doctors, the midwives, we kind of are on the same page. And often, and this is particularly reference to the public hospital that I work at and in my own personal practice, we have what we call TOLAC or VBAC champions. And in my case, if you're seeing me, I just happen to be one of those champions at the hospital, where we provide a degree of consistent counselling to the women so that the women who, for example, would come to my team publicly, and of course if they see me privately, they're going to get consistent advice around the stats, the safety, the outcomes, the processes. And the process we have in place for recommendations of monitoring and so on during the course of the labour, which of course is an attempt at having a vaginal delivery, so we call it a trial of labour, but once again may not lead to a completely normal birth. And so it's really important that you go in with that understanding that it may not be the outcome you'd hope for, despite starting with that intent.
So you might be monitored more closely during labour?
We would advise it, and I don't really know of any jurisdictions that wouldn't advise it. You would be recommended to be monitored. Now, everything is a choice, so we give you advice. You take that advice or not, but we would be documenting everything we give you in terms of advice. So most of the time we would love to see you labouring efficiently. We may offer to do things during the course of the labour that can enhance efficiency, and one simple example of that might be a timely breaking of your waters if they haven't broken. That can help with labour efficiency. often there's a recommendation for just having a little IV bung in your arm with some bloods taken, not connected up to a drip or anything like that, but just to have available in the event you have an acute event and we need to provide you with urgent medical support, fluids, medication, etc. And the monitoring is really to ensure that the baby is coping with the demands of the labour and that we are using that as an additional reference point for how the scar might be behaving, so that if we're getting a sense that the scar is at a critical point and it's no longer safe to continue, we can then guide you to say, look, we think it might be timely to consider a caesarean section. I know that wasn't your birth preference, you're here labouring, but it's just not for you today. And if you're agreeable to that, we can then escalate to an emergency Caesar when necessary.
Pete, you mentioned that you share some statistics with the patients who are considering this. What are some of those statistics that you usually share with them?
Sure. So usually around 60 to 65% of the women who attempt a TOLAC will have a vaginal delivery. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be you push the baby out yourself. There'll be a percentage of those women, upwards of 15%, where the forceps or the vacuum may be required. If you have a vaginal delivery, we know that in most hospitals and most care provided settings, 90% of the time you'll have some stitches in the vagina because the head will crown and split the skin. I alluded to the fact that there's a 1 in 200 chance that the scar can rupture in labour. We also know that about 40% of women, despite their best intentions, will want to have an epidural in labour. That's with reference to their first labour. So if this is your first labour, because you might have had an elective caesarean section for a breech or a placenta previa the first time, then 40% of the time you'll want to have an epidural. As an interesting statistic, if you've had an epidural in your first pregnancy, in your first labour, and you ended up having a caesarean section, you try to labour the second time, we know that it would be really great if you're having a TOLAC to try and avoid an epidural for birth efficiency. But we know statistically that 80 to 85% of women who had an epidural in their first pregnancy are going to want to have one the second time. Now, thankfully, that probably won't impact on your birth efficiency. It won't impact on your ability to contract and dilate, etc. But with an epidural in, one of the things it can do is mask pain, which is good, which is why you had it. But masking pain means if you were to be in that rare situation where the uterus ruptures, you won't have any pain as a reference point. So my advice to all women when you're attempting a TOLAC is to keep it as natural as possible. Prepare for that birth as you would in any birth. Look at doing some form of calm birthing or Lamaze birthing, and a classic case of that is where Narelle, who works with the Parents You've Got This, runs a wonderful class to teach you those skill sets for that mindfulness and breathing. Prepare your perineum so that when the head crowns, it will crown well, because you've already had stitches in your tummy. You want stitches in your vagina as well. So do the prep and be motivated and have like-minded people looking after you, whether it be an obstetrician like myself, the midwives or doctors at the public hospital. It is probably the one situation where I'd be very happy to say, please, 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 for a birth of this nature, birth in a hospital. You will never see me advocating for having a birth like this at home. That would be, in my opinion, not safe and not wise.
Well, Peter, thank you so much, as always, for coming on the Expert Guide to Parenthood podcast and sharing all your wisdom.
A huge thanks to Mistela for sponsoring this episode. Did you know that Mistela is not only for babies and children? Mistela also has a range of maternity products, like the 100% certified organic Stretch Marks oil, Stretch Marks cream, and the certified organic lanolin-free nipple balm, made up of 100% natural ingredients and dermatologist tested.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Expert Guide to Parenthood podcast. Never forget, parents, you've got this.
Join a Parents You've Got This masterclass today to be prepared, excited and educated for pregnancy, birth, baby and parenthood. Visit www.parentsyou'vegotthis.com.au and sign up for a masterclass today.
The information provided in this podcast is general in nature and is intended to support, not replace, a discussion with your doctor or healthcare professional. Parents You've Got This take no responsibility for any medical decisions made by individuals based on the information provided in this podcast.